Yeah, I'm a software developer working for a little charity called Discipleship Tech, I want to talk today about this idea: what can we learn from games? And At Discipleship Tech, our passion is using technology to help people get to know Jesus better, which is a deliberately fairly broad kind of tagline. So the thing we're best known for is an app called PrayerMate, which I've been developing over the past sort of 11 years now, to help people be consistent in praying, both sort of for their own immediate concerns and family and personal godliness and things, but also for the wider world and the persecuted church and things like that. We also run a little app called Redeeming Time to help you get stuck into the Bible in some of those spare moments. The project perhaps most closely connected to today's topic is one we're working on called The Serpent and the Seed, which in many ways has really been my kind of lifelong passion project. Just to give you a bit of background, I've been playing games my whole life, back since they look like the ones I'm showing here, on the BBC Master, BBC Micro. So the game I've been playing this week is Return to Monkey Island. I don't know if you're a Monkey Island fan, anyone out there, but this basically, we've been waiting for this for 30 years, which is a new game from the series creator. So we're very excited about this, and it's been a real joy to get to share my love of games with my kids. So that's been really fun. But I've also been sort of trying to make games my whole life. So the one on the left there is a game called Danger Dog, which I spent hours and hours copying out the code from a magazine that my dad got. It was just such a thrill as a young kid to see it finally come to life when we got all the code right. The one on the right is like the demo game that came with something called Q Basic, which was something I did a lot of as a sort of young teen. So what can we learn from games? Is there anything to learn from games? Are they just a kind of frivolous waste of time? I think there's actually a ton that we can learn from games, and there is actually a deliberate ambiguity in that title. What can we learn from games? I think there's kind of two ways you could answer this. Firstly, and the one that I'm probably going to focus on mostly today, I think games are actually a fantastic vehicle for teaching. Like, if you want to kind of get all fancy, like basically games as a didactic tool. How can we use games directly to communicate something to people, to teach something? But there's also, I think, a lot we can learn from games for kind of our other kind of apps, businesses, projects, things that are not themselves games. And that's the idea of gamification. And I'll hopefully have time to touch on that a little bit later on, although I don't want to go too much in that direction because I know Toby Beresford's doing a session tomorrow exploring that in more detail. So what can we learn from games? I wonder what thoughts pop into your mind when you hear that question. Is there anything that you remember learning from a game yourself? So I asked my eldest son this, and he immediately, without blinking, said E equals MC squared. That left me scratching my head a little bit, but apparently he was taught that by a character called the IQ Worm from a silly little game he played recently called Piku Niku. So there you go. I don't know what you make of that. For me, without question, the best example of something I learned from a video game is from LucasArts' Day of the Tentacle, which is utterly ridiculous, but you meet the founding fathers of the USA, and I've got just a silly clip here. You meet George Washington.
Excuse me. Yes? Whoa, you're like George Washington. Very much like him, according to my wife, Mrs. Washington. Is it
and
true
you get to ask him about some of those kind of
tree?
legends and things surrounding him, like the cherry
yes,
trees.
it's quite true. Why, I've cut down acres of cherry trees in my day. Do you really
Now, it's obviously kind of ridiculous and exaggerated, and I'd caution anyone against kind of using Day of the Tentacle as a substitute for revising for your history A level or whatever it is. But like, you have to bear in mind, before playing that game as I don't know how old I was, 12, 14, something like that, I had absolutely zero knowledge or awareness of US history. And even if a lot of the details were a bit off, it taught me some of the kind of key concepts. It introduced some of the key characters. So there you meet George Washington and John Hancock and somebody else, I can't remember it immediately. And explore some of those kind of common legends around them. But perhaps most importantly for me, it kind of planted a lifelong kind of connection or interest in those characters and that period of history that made me then want to seek out the real story. So if I'd never played Day of a Tentacle and instead somebody had bought me a school textbook on the topic of the US Constitution, I never would have opened it or read it. Yet if you put that same information in a game format and add a bit of humor around it, and suddenly it doesn't even feel like learning, it was just fun. Now here's a chap called Jonathan Blow, who is kind of quite a respected secular games designer. He designed a fantastic game called Braid, which is a really interesting exploration of kind of forgiveness and wanting to undo the mistakes of the past, and well worth kind of checking out if you haven't come across it. And he said this, he said all games actively teach, by which he meant not just kind of in a Day of a Tentacle style, like here's some information, but actually even through the kind of gameplay itself, the way the game is structured, you've got these kind of reward mechanisms that are kind of trying to teach you what kind of behaviors are desirable and patterns of thought, that kind of thing. But then he also said many people will be playing games. We heard from Jay earlier today some stats around just the vast number of people playing games, which is just going up and up. All games teach something, but the question is, what are we going to be teaching all these people? Which I just thought was a really interesting to hear that coming from someone who's not a Christian. Just as an example of this, I would just want to show you a brief chat a bit about this game called Stardew Valley. I've been playing this with my kids a couple of years back during the lockdowns, and superficially it seems like a really simple kind of farming simulator, but it's really interesting how it kind of brought out the different styles of play in my different children. So one of them was all about maximizing profits, getting as much money as he could. And he used to kind of slightly make fun of my youngest son, who never had any money, because he was so busy giving away everything he grew to friends as gifts. You can kind of gift things to different villages, and it kind of asked that question, like, what do you value? What's important? Is it profit? Is it friendship and community? And it's interesting how the game actually kind of has these built-in kind of value systems. So there's a stage where you get given kind of candles based on the different achievements, and if you've got married or had kids, you get more candles. So there's this kind of implicit suggestion that you're somehow more kind of valuable if you've achieved those kind of life goals, I suppose. And there's also some slightly sort of subtle hidden elements to the game, like these sort of unseen forces governing the world in these different spirits, and you have a kind of luck factor each day that affects how likely you are to get certain rewards. So I just thought that was quite an interesting example of how a seemingly simple game already has this very strong kind of value system. And so if all games teach, wouldn't it be great if they could be teaching us true things about God from the Bible? That's been my kind of lifelong interest, I suppose, and the thing I've always wanted to explore. The best example of that I've seen explicitly in a game is this game called Righteous Tales, David versus Goliath. My kids have absolutely loved playing this game, and it's been great to see how it, just as for me, Day of a Tentacle gave me that kind of connection with US history, Righteous Tales has given, certainly my eldest son, this kind of real connection with the book of 1 Samuel, and he wanted, having played the game so much, he wanted to go to the Bible and read, how can I read about David and Goliath and things in the grown-up Bible. So I found that really exciting. So that's kind of what sparked for me this idea of the serpent and the seed, which we're working on at Discipleship Tech. So this is designed to be a kind of mobile game exploring the big story of the Bible, and in particular tracing that kind of promise of the seed of the woman who will crush the head of the seed of the serpent, and seeing how that promise kind of plays out in the rest of the Bible. And we want to do it in a way that doesn't feel like Bible bashing. It's something deliberately designed for people who wouldn't normally open the Bible for themselves. Yeah, so the emphasis has got to be on it being fun and enjoyable, hopefully having a bit of that kind of humor and stuff that's in Day of a Tentacle, but but also with that sort of gravitas of the kind of getting the tone right in terms of what we're tackling in the big Bible story. So we've been working on that for probably a year and almost 2 years now. Probably still another year or so away, but if you know any artists who are interested in making art for games, do send them our way. We would love to meet them in particular. I'll show a few other games. I don't know if you've come across this one called That Dragon Cancer. This is a game. It wouldn't describe itself as a Christian game, although it is made by Christians. It had a massive kind of impact on the mainstream consciousness, with lots of secular publications covering it. And it is shot through with a thoroughly Christian worldview, which I think is what makes it so impactful. And it's really kind of grappling with that crisis of faith that these two Christian parents face as they deal with the terminal illness of their young son, Joel. So that's a really kind of slightly, very different take from The Serpent and the Seed, but of how a game that isn't explicitly Christian can really sort of introduce those themes of faith and in a way that's really engaged with a lot of players who are not themselves Christians. But I think there's also this kind of flip side of that. Something that Dragon Cancer does really well is how the gameplay itself reinforces the ideas it's trying to teach. And there's this idea of the kind of what's called the Ludo-Narrative, like what story is created by the gameplay. And here's a slightly absurd game called I Am Jesus Christ that has sort of been hitting headlines a lot lately. I'm fairly sure it was created to deliberately stir up controversy and mockery as its marketing strategy. And this is a scene where Jesus is casting out the demon from, it's in Mark's Gospel. And but the thing is, Jesus, you're sort of desperately trying to hit this demon, but Jesus keeps running out of faith. And he has to run over to a corner to kind of restock on Holy Spirit power. And if you're familiar with the Gospel accounts, you'll notice that this is totally at odds with how it's presented in the Bible, where Jesus is utterly in control. There's really very little drama about it in the Bible account. Jesus just says, come out, and the demon does. There's no kind of will he, won't he kind of drama about it. In other words, the gameplay itself is actually teaching you something. It's kind of suggesting that there's a kind of that Jesus is kind of at risk of running out of power somehow. So that's kind of really the big first part that I wanted to talk about there. What can we learn from games? I think games can be a fantastic tool for teaching the Bible. I'm really excited about the potential. I think it's relatively untapped. There are Bible games out there, but a lot of them are quite dry in my experience, and sort of do have more of the feel of a kind of Sunday school lesson. I think what makes Righteous Tales so exciting is how it is just fun. It's a proper game that my kids really enjoy playing for its own sake, not just for what they can learn from it. We're excited about The Serpent and the Seed. I'd love to see more games kind of exploring that potential. I will just briefly touch on this other aspect. If we're not making games, if we're not kind of interested in games, do games have anything to teach us? And that's this idea of gamification. So gamification, Wikipedia says it's the application of game design elements and game principles in non-game contexts. So basically, this might be like giving people points or badges, having leaderboards, or even things like just being able to customize your profile and having an avatar or a photo. You'll recognize loads of these in many things that are not sort of explicitly games. So some simple examples are like onboarding tasks when you install a new app and it's got a little checklist, and it just gives you that sense of accomplishment and progress as you get set up. Or if you've got an Apple Watch, trying to complete your rings, it's basically using a game to motivate real world behaviors. I've seen a more extreme example of this thing called Chore Wars, sort of trying to turn getting your washing up and cleaning done into a kind of competitive game with your housemates. Or you might have seen it in more spiritual contexts like streaks in YouVersion, like this kind of trying to motivate you to keep reading your Bible day after day to maintain your streak. A lot of people have suggested for PrayerMate we should build in this idea of streaks and trying to motivate people that way. But I do actually have a bit of kind of nervousness about this, because I think there are right ways and wrong ways to motivate Christian behavior. And because of that idea of the Ludo-Narrative that we've talked about, what is this gameplay, even if it's sort of in the very loosest sense of the word gameplay, what is it teaching us? What's it communicating to us? Is it measuring the right thing? YouVersion even has this verse, don't merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says, from James. But a reading streak isn't actually measuring if you're listening and doing the word. It's literally just measuring, have you read it every day? And potentially I feel like there is a risk it's kind of reinforcing this idea. As long as I've read my Bible, then God must be pleased with me. There was a book called Enjoy Your Prayer Life by Mike Reeves that had a kind of caution about prayer apps, when I'm pretty sure PrayerMate was pretty much the only prayer app that existed at that point. So I've always taken it as a slightly personal rebuke. But don't think that just because you're using this app every day that God must be pleased with me more than others. And I did do a little bit of Googling around this. Someone posted this sort of little story about basically their kind of broken heart the day they realized that their kind of year-long YouVersion reading streak was broken, and they just felt utterly like they'd lost something, and it just made them realize that their kind of attitude before God, their heart was really not right. So you probably won't be able to see this slide, but this is basically, there's loads of different kind of methods of gamification, different kind of core motivations that they basically tap into. And I think where I've got to in this is that probably as Christians, there are some of these motivations that we'd be a lot more comfortable with than others. Some suggested drives of like around meaning, the desire to feel that our actions have purpose. Well, I think there's loads of scope for a prayer app to reinforce the kind of meaning of prayer, that, as you kind of see God working to answer prayer, there's this kind of lovely virtuous circle of encouragement that it's worth praying, because then we get to see God answering those prayers. Whereas perhaps some of them we'd be perhaps a bit more nervous of. So some of this kind of sense of accomplishment, I'm a bit nervous of turning prayer into this kind of sense of look how great I've done at praying. So there we go. There's just a few thoughts. There's a lot more that could be said on this topic, but hopefully that's a good conversation starter.